15 years after their release, two widely acclaimed biographies continue to shape perceptions of Ayn Rand's life and work. But do these biographies accurately represent Ayn Rand, the novelist and philosopher behind such books as Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead? Welcome to the podcast of the Ayn Rand Institute. I'm Aaron Smith. With me today is Senior Fellow Elan Journo. Elan, you published two articles recently, and I just want to read out the titles. They're strongly worded. Goddess of the Market, Ayn Rand and the American Right is worse than incompetent. Okay, that's the first one. That's the longer article. And then a shorter follow-up article titled Postscript. Ayn Rand and the World She Made is an exploitative tabloid biography. Now, these are strong words, and in those articles, you argue that both books, despite their scholarly pretensions, are deeply flawed and give distorted, shallow interpretations of Ayn Rand. And I want to dig into what you think is so appalling about these biographies. But before we do this, I've got to ask, why revisit these biographies now? This is like a decade and a half after they were published in, 2009. What prompted you to revisit them?
Well, Aaron, one of the things we do at the Institute, as you know, is we track mentions of Ayn Rand. That includes in articles, in books, in media. And what I noticed in the last few years, in particular, I paid more attention to it. I noticed the repeated mention of these two books by Jennifer Burns and Anne Heller. And they just keep getting cited by journalists and scholars. And I was surprised by this because it's become sort of layers upon layers of citations, and they're starting to get the status of a standard biography or a reputable source. And my assessment is very different. And the tipping point for me wanting to become involved in this and write about them is I was invited to be a guest speaker in a class for MBA students. And one of the things I noticed, it was a very good class, and the professor was very good and diligent about presenting Ayn Rand's ideas. One of the readings the students had was a case study about Ayn Rand. And in that, Anne Heller's book was cited. It was the most cited work in that. It was a very detailed case. And I thought, there's something going wrong here. If this is what students are getting taught, if this is what's in journals and in the media and in new books about Ayn Rand. So I wanted to address that. And it's one of those cases where it's an article I wish I had written before, and I finally got around to it. So I think it's an important point to be made. And the main driver for me is these books have gotten an undeserved reputation. And part of my goal was to set the record straight. And they don't get, I think, what is essential to Ayn Rand. They don't actually do the job that they're advertised as doing, which is they posture as nonpartisan and objective. And I think they're neither of those things. And that's the main thing I wanted to bring out to people.
Okay. And in your articles, a major criticism that you have of both the Burns and the Heller biographies concerns not so much disagreements with their evaluation of Ayn Rand or disagreements with positions and so on, but it has to do with their non-objectivity in their method. Could you expand on that? Like, what are some of the standards of objectivity that you'd expect in an intellectual biography, and in what ways do you think these books fall short? And apparently, from your perspective, fall short massively.
Yeah, I think that's the elephant in the room. Why is someone at the Ayn Rand Institute criticizing other people who've written biographies of Ayn Rand? Is it just that I'm never going to be satisfied? I'm a super fan. Am I looking for something that's entirely flattering and so on? That's not at all the case. That's not what I think of as a standard for a biography. And my goal in writing about their approach to the subject is, as you put it, is to assess their objectivity and their ability to engage with Ayn Rand. So it's really important to emphasize, it's not that I primarily disagree with their assessments or the points they make or their evaluations or their analysis. It's that their method of getting to those conclusions is the problem that I disagree with. So let me indicate three things that I argue for in my piece on Jennifer Burns's book, which is the same criteria I use in evaluating Anne Heller's book too. So the three things. One is, if you're going to engage in writing a biography about an intellectual figure, and particularly a controversial one, you have to understand and take seriously their own self-concept of their career, their work, their theories, their arguments, if they've stated anything in that direction, like if they've been silent on it and they're a complete mystery, no, they've never commented on that topic, okay, then it's a different proposition. But Ayn Rand, like many intellectuals, has had a lot to say about her direction, her path. And I think one would have to start by taking that very seriously and saying, here's how she thinks of herself. She thinks she's a novelist philosopher. There's a whole account of why she thinks she's both of those things, and it's not one or the other. You have to take that into account, and then you don't have to agree with it as a biographer. That's certainly not true. You don't even have to admire Ayn Rand or any subject that you're writing a biography about, but you have to have arguments for whether you think that's right or wrong, their own self-assessment, because that's a relevant factor, their own evaluation of their work. So that's one, the self-concept of the subject. What do you think of it? What is the evidence you have if you disagree? And how convincing is it? The second one is, I think it's a baseline expectation that you would want, this is true for all biographies. Has the biographer attentively read and understood the material put forth by the person they're writing about? In this case, it's Ayn Rand, but this will be true if you're writing about Karl Marx, or if you're writing about Sigmund Freud or George Orwell, or someone else who is in the same kind of genre as an intellectual, who's writing about important issues and sees themselves as doing important work in that way. So if you, again, this doesn't mean you have to agree with what they're saying, or even that you become a world expert in what they're saying. We have people like that on our staff, and our colleagues are experts in Ayn Rand's life, Ayn Rand's philosophy. You teach Ayn Rand's philosophy. That's not the standard. I don't think you have to be that level of expert, but you have to be able to read and understand and be able to explain to the reader of your biography, this is what Ayn Rand is arguing. Then you can decide what you think of that. And I think, again, it's important to stress, this would be true whether you're writing about Ayn Rand or someone like Karl Marx. And again, it's not a requirement that you agree or even respect this position, because I could imagine a capitalist writing about Karl Marx and thinking Karl Marx's ideas are pernicious, and I want to write a biography because I think there's important things to say here.
But here are what his ideas are.
Exactly. And you could do the same thing with Ayn Rand. You could say, I disagree with Ayn Rand, and I'm going to tell you what she actually stood for. You can form your own opinion of that. So that's the second position, second criterion. Let me mention the third, which again, I don't think any of these three are controversial. I think they're universal, that you would apply them in similar cases. It's just what you expect of any piece of nonfiction, that it take the goal of objectivity in writing and research very seriously. So what does that look like? If you're dealing with sources, one of the questions you have to ask yourself is, how credible is a given source? How is there bias in here? Is there some subtext, some agenda that I need to think about as a biographer? And what do I say about that? So it doesn't mean you can't touch a source if it's got some of those features, but you would have to treat it objective, which means to recognize that, yeah, some of this might be polluted by a bias. Well, some of this might be, this source is obviously vindictive, or this person has a grudge, but there might be interesting things to draw out from that source. But you can't pretend that it isn't there if you notice it. And that includes one's own perspective. Like if you are going in and saying, I think Ayn Rand is a terrible thinker, I don't think she's a good writer, and I'm going to write a biography of her, you have to at least be upfront with people that that's your view, as opposed to letting that bias be in the background, active but not admitted, which I think that's just objectivity regardless of the subject. It would be the same thing again if you were writing about Marx and you're going in with, yeah, I think Marx is a terrible intellectual, and you don't tell the readers that, and you just let it color your work, then you're not being objective. Now you could say up front, yeah, I think this is true of Marx, and here are the ways I think that manifests. So I'm going to tell you this up front, and you can evaluate my work with that in mind. Again, this is true of any writing in nonfiction. You have to think seriously about the evidence you're presenting, the sources, their credibility, limitations of sources, historical limitations. There's a lot to be said about how this plays out, but at that high level, it's take the subject's own self-concept seriously. That's number one. Number two is understanding their work in such a way that you can explain it to people. And three, just objectivity in your ability to process the evidence and the sources. And I think in all of these, this is true for any similar subject. It's not unique to Ayn Rand. I'm not holding her to some special criteria here. And I think what you find in these two biographies, Anne Heller's book and Jennifer Burns's book, they don't meet these standards, and it's worse than incompetence, because I think both of them should know better. They're trained in their respective fields of history and journalism, and neither of them lives up to these standards. I think that's the approach that I take. And what you get in both books, and this is the saddest part of this, is Ayn Rand is a fascinating figure, whether you agree with her or not. And I think what you get from these books is not something that illuminates her, but something that makes her life less interesting and less intelligible. Instead of learning about the mind behind the Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, Virtue of Selfishness, really controversial works that have upended people's debates and people's view of the world. Instead of learning about the mind behind that, what you get is a cardboard character or an effigy, something that's not at all, I think, true to life or borne out by the evidence.
Yeah. I want to ask a follow-up about the first point you made, the thing about acknowledging an author's self-concept. I find that interesting, and I think there's I don't know if this is true of intellectual biographies in general, or if there's sort of a trend in the field of intellectual biography, but I read a book on Ayn Rand that had to do with her reception of her work in Europe. And the author was arguing that Ayn Rand tried to go through 5 steps of iconization. And it was sort of like, where is this coming from? Like, it had no connection to what Ayn Rand ever took herself to be doing. And it was a similar kind of example of that. It was, why would you think this? It's like an overlay. But what does she actually think that she's doing? What was she trying to do? Because she's not, as Nietzsche says, she didn't fail to bear witness. She didn't fail to bear witness. You know, I mean, she tells you, like, this is what I see myself as doing. I'm trying to project a moral ideal. The reason why I got into fiction writing was this. Here's how I see the relationship between my philosophical perspective and my fiction writing. Here's why I don't see these kind of things at odds. This is what I'm trying to do. And it looks like they're really trying to push it into some kind of Procrustean bed. Like, this is what it's got to be. This is what it looks like. And there's a sort of, seems to be like an implicit suspicion of an author's self-concept. And I don't know if it's just Ayn Rand or if this is a trend or whatever, but I think you just can't do that, particularly from the perspective of objectivity, when this subject that you're writing about tells you that this is what I'm doing. If that isn't part of your analysis, and you might disagree and think there's something going on, but then you have to make a case against that. It can't just be you sort of elide that whole aspect of her thought.
Yeah, that's really disturbing to hear. I think we talked about this book offline at some point when you were reading it. I'd like to pick that up at some point. I can't speak to whether this is part of a trend, because these, as you said, these books came out 15 years ago. Things might have changed since then. I will emphasize, there is a point here I really want to emphasize, which is that Jennifer Burns's book presents itself as a scholarly work. And in my article about it, I give evidence to show that I don't think it really lives up to scholarly standards. And I don't think it's actually a study of Ayn Rand and the American right, which is what its announced purpose is. And I think that's part of what's disappointing to me, because I'm interested in that subject, and I thought the book doesn't really help you understand that. But what you get in that book is a kind of de facto biography of Ayn Rand that leans a little bit towards political issues. And this goes to the point about not taking seriously her self-concept. And as you emphasize, it's not the case that the biographer has to agree with her Ayn Rand self-concept, but you have to take seriously, she spent time telling people, this is what I think of my career. This is how I've understood myself in relation to other thinkers, and in relation to fiction, in relation to other schools of thought and literary schools. You can't brush that aside and then impose on Ayn Rand's life and career what I think of as a preconception, which is Ayn Rand's most important contribution is in politics, which is what Jennifer Burns contends, and political thought. And that's the lens through which she tries to view Ayn Rand. Now, okay, you can have a book where that's the delimitation. I'm going to look at Ayn Rand as a figure in the political space, thinking about deep ideas in how to organize society. Fine, I'm not arguing against that kind of focus. But if you do that, you have to take the effort seriously of saying, although she thinks of herself as a systematic philosopher and a novelist whose work in fiction integrates with that, I don't agree. Here's evidence why she's wrong about her own view of herself. And here's evidence for why my prism is more illuminating or more relevant or more useful or something else that gives it some justification. I don't think you see any of that from Jennifer Burns. And this is, in some ways, it's if you, for the people who are listening to us and have read Ayn Rand, I'll give an example that will probably resonate really strongly. If you haven't read Ayn Rand, I'll give some of the evidence for why this is preposterous. So one of the things Jennifer Burns does in trying to focus her book on Ayn Rand as a political thinker and exclusively as a political thinker, there's just not really any evidence presented that Jennifer Burns takes Ayn Rand's philosophy seriously or thinks of her political thought as coming out of a systematic philosophy. So what Jennifer Burns insists on, and I think this is a case of, it might not strictly speaking be the fallacy of begging the question, but it sure looks like that fallacy, which is I'm going to insist on the claim that I would ordinarily be required to prove and just pretend that I've proven it. And that's what you see in this. So Jennifer Burns goes to great lengths to try to show that whatever Ayn Rand thought The Fountainhead was about, it's actually a political book. And Fountainhead is one of my favorite books. It's the book that got me ignited about Ayn Rand's ideas. And I have to say, that never occurred to me when I read it. And I've read it numerous times. And I don't think the evidence in the book, what the plot is about, the characters, the theme, and even what Ayn Rand thinks about the book, I don't think any of that justifies the claim that it's essentially a political book. So what are some of the evidence that it's not a political? First of all, Ayn Rand says her view of the theme is it's about collectivism, not in politics, but in men's soul. So it's a psychological, moral perspective on how people relate to each other and relate to society. And it's a profoundly psychologically rich book. I mean, anyone who's read it will know you learn a lot about the mentality of someone like Peter Keating, who's the contrasting figure to Howard Rourke, the hero who's independent and has integrity, versus Peter Keating, who is more of the conformist, as Ayn Rand characterizes him as second-hander. And then you just look through the book and the way the plot unfolds, and nothing about the character's motivations can be explained as a political stand. So there's a character, Dominique Francon, and she goes to war against the man that she falls in love with, and she tries to destroy his career, consciously tries to destroy his career. That's not a political motivation. That goes to a deep perspective that Ayn Rand brings into the book about one's view of the place of moral ideals in life. Just pause on that. So
government is absent from most of the book. There's one government-funded project or something, but beyond that, the government is absent from the book. It's not like it's not a major theme. It's just not discussed. The Fountainhead's about how to face life, and to push that is, it's really about politics. And the question is, what's the really doing, and what's the argument for the really? Because it's a bizarre kind of claim.
And I thought about this a lot.
It shows that there's a presupposition. There's not a presupposition. That's nice. That there's a preformed view, I think, in the background.
Yeah, I think so. I've thought about this a lot, particularly when I was writing the article. I was like, why would she press this point? Why does Burns press this point? Because it's not credible on its face. There's no evidence to justify it in her own account. And insofar as I can put it together, my assumption is something like what you're saying. So she's coming in with a preconception. She's trying to fit she already has a conclusion. She's trying to justify it. It's not what the evidence gave her. It's not borne out by the facts. It's not like she arrived at this inductively. It's more like she came in and now she's trying to find things to fit. And that's the sense in which it's like a Procrustean bed. So the legend of Procrustes is this highway robber who just fits people on a bed. If they're too long, he cuts them off, the limbs. If they're not long enough, he stretches them out. And I think that's really what you get in her treatment of Rand. But the other aspect of this is, I think it might be in part a real confusion about how Ayn Rand thinks of morality relating to politics, because it's not as if her conception of the individual being independent-minded and having integrity, which is the characteristics of her hero in the story, it's not as if that doesn't have political implications. But that's not the same thing as the book being about politics. It certainly has implications. Like, the more independent minds you have as a population, the less susceptible they are to being dominated by authoritarians, and less susceptible they are to collectivist ideologies. But that's not what the book is about primarily. The book is about how to face life. It's a fundamental question. Do you orient yourself to other people, or do you orient yourself to the facts and your own judgment, and treating your judgment as sovereign and not as something you borrow from other people? So that's, I mean, this is, we talked a bit about this example, and in my article, I give more evidence for why I think her treatment of the Fountainhead as a work of, as a political book is really just baseless and not at all defended as you would need it to be defended. And I would just say here, just one other aspect of this, it took a lot of work on my part to treat her analysis of Rand fairly, because I disagree with it. But I think that the focus really has to be, is the scholar here, is Burns engaging in the kind of work that's needed to be objective? And that's what I was focusing on throughout. So again, I'm criticizing her for analysis of the Fountain, but it's not primarily because I disagree with it. It's because I think her approach to it methodologically is unsound. And therefore, I think she ends up in the wrong place in terms of her view. Anyway, so I just want to leave that there and encourage people to go read the article and see for yourself if you think that analysis is borne out.
Let me say one more thing just to tag onto that, and then I want to move on to another question. But in the analyses that I've read of Ayn Rand, where they try to make the claim, or they assume that she's primarily a political thinker, in the book on Europe, it was the same one, same thing. It's primarily a political thinker and influence on the right. You could be confused about that and not understand her work. That's possible. But I think what it allows one to do is to ignore the philosophy. It allows one to not have to confront, grapple with, understand, confront, face that she's a philosopher, and that her perspective in politics is coming from a deeper philosophical perspective, that there's a new radical moral perspective. And there's a new conception of the nature of objectivity. There's a new conception of the relationship between consciousness and existence, or mind and world, if you want to put it that way. And that then you can treat her as more superficially, because then you can say, well, I mean, as Ayn Rand said, I didn't invent capitalism, for Christ's sake. It's sort of like, so, okay, she's just, she's on the right, she's kind of capitalist, and so she had some influence over there, but we don't have to look over here, because she might think that she's offering some new revolutionary moral perspective, but yeah, it's self-interest, Anyway, so let's look over here at politics, and I think it allows it allows an anti-intellectual or unintellectual, or at least unphilosophical perspective on her. And I think, well, I want to get to more of that. I want to ask you about that in later, but let me switch to another question. We've been talking about the fact that your major criticism is their lack of objectivity and method in these two biographies. But just so it doesn't hang too abstractly, we talked about the example from the Fountainhead, which is a good one. Can we get some specific examples, or do you want to? Well, you want to get some specific examples of where you think the author's treatment of Ayn Rand really suffers because of that lack of objectivity and method.
Yeah, I think if we think about one of the three criteria we talked about earlier, understanding the subject self-concept, understanding their work, and then research and writing in an objective way. Let's take the second one of those, understanding her work, just presenting it objectively. Like, what does she actually stand for? And that's a factual issue. You don't have to agree with it to be able to present it effectively. That's just part of a job of being able to be an effective expositor of other people's views. And you would do that in a classroom. When you teach other thinkers, or you teach views you don't agree with, it should be irrelevant to the students what your position is. Your job is to teach this the position, here's the argument, and then you can bring in analysis separately. And I think here are a couple of examples that I bring up in the article, and I dissect them a bit more in depth. But just to give a flavor of this, I think it's on page 3 of Jennifer Burns's book. She has the line, and I'll read it verbatim. In her work, the state is always a destroyer, acting to frustrate and inhibit the natural ingenuity and drive of individuals, close quote. That's false. That's just not Ayn Rand's view. And Jennifer Burns knows this is not Ayn Rand's view, because later in the book, she talks about essays. She cites essays where Ayn Rand talks about her own concept of government. And it's not that the government is always a destroyer. Ayn Rand's view is that government is a necessary good. It becomes a destroyer when it deviates from its proper function, in her view, of protecting individual rights. Now, Burns refers to the two essays, Man's Rights and Nature of Government, where Ayn Rand puts this position in writing. So it's not that you need more archival research to find out what her position is. It's right there in books that are circulating. At least 1 million copies of one of these books is in circulation. You can find the articles online. This is not a shortcoming of research. This is just having attention to what you're reading and presenting it objectively. Now, so this is at least, to be most charitable, you say this is an editing error. So this is early in the book. It's not a trivial footnote. This is in the introduction. And it mischaracterizes Ayn Rand because it leaves the impression that she's so-called anti-government, which is the way people frame it. She's not anti-government. That's not the right way to conceptualize it. She's not an anarchist. She's not a libertarian, which some of the libertarians are, in that sense, opposed to government per se. And anarchists are, by definition, opposed to government per se. So this is a mischaracterization. And this is not a journalistic book. This is a scholarly book and from Oxford University Press, which is, you would expect a much higher level of rigor. Okay, so that's just one example. Like, this is not even what she stands for. And then to the point you raised earlier about the focus on politics and political ideas, political philosophy. And again, I'll emphasize, I think you could write a book about Ayn Rand that focuses on her as a political philosopher. I think there could be a justifiable way to do that if that's your purpose. If you did that, to be objective, you would have to integrate that with the claim Ayn Rand makes, which is her politics are derivative of her basic philosophy. This is the point you were alluding to. So she has a system of philosophy of which politics is a consequence. And she was at pains in numerous essays, numerous talks to tell people, listen, politics is downstream in effect. It's a consequence. It's a derivative. It follows ethics and it follows your view of the individual and their ability to think or not to think. There's a real logic to her position in politics. It's not just, she woke up one day, she picked up a book, I'm going to be for individual rights, and that's the end of the story. There's a logic to why she has a view of individual rights.
Her parents' store was confiscated by the Soviets, and therefore it's, yeah.
Yeah, so it's coming out of midstream. It's not taking seriously what she actually thought as a political philosopher. So even on that score, it's not an objective presentation of her view. I want to mention one quick example from Anne Heller's book, which just mentioned in passing. And it's the one that I wrote least about because it's hard to take it seriously. But it is the one that gets a lot of attention. So Anne Heller is a journalist and approaches the project with what I would regard as a cavalier disregard for objectivity. Anne Heller says very little, and shockingly little, about Ayn Rand's nonfiction writing. Now, the reason I say it's shocking because at least half of Ayn Rand's career was writing about, speaking about, teaching about her philosophy and its applications to the world. So everything she did after Atlas Shrugged was published is, here's my philosophy. Here, I want you to understand it better. Here are applications to it. Yeah,
it's a 20-year period of writing.
It's a big part of her life. So, and if you don't talk about that and seriously engage with what she said accurately, you're not doing your job. So just to give a concrete example here, Ayn Rand has an essay called The Ethics of Emergency. And the way it's presented in Anne Heller's book, it's this drive-by comment about it. Anne Heller seems to think one of the takeaways from that essay is about the dangers of prolonging national emergencies, or like emergency situations that the government then would seize. But that is not even close to what that essay is about. That essay is about the way people's view of ethics is distorted, such that they, by the doctrine of self-sacrifice, the contemporary thought of the idea of altruism, the way that distorts people's view into thinking that morality is really just about these rare, exceptional cases where you're on a lifeboat and what do? You're running out of food and there's another person on the boat. What do you do? Or you're on a trolley and do you let the trolley kill 3 people or 6 people? And how do you decide that kind of very strange kind of out of daily life context? And then daily life people don't really have guidance. And what she's saying in that essay is, this is not the right way to think about the way morality should guide you. It's a daily guide to think about how you live, and it's a needed guide, versus the way most people hold ethics, which is this thing that you do in ethics class, or it's maybe sometimes lawyers need it, but there's exceptional cases, and we don't really think about it. In that sense, it's an emergency need, not a daily need. And hell, she just doesn't get even that basic point, let alone the significance of Ayn Rand's position. So I think Heller reveals herself as not really engaging with Ayn Rand's position, because she's not reporting it accurately to begin with, let alone evaluating it. So leave aside what she thinks of the position, but just what is the position in this essay? It's not accurately described in the book. Now, there's many more things I could say about the mischaracterization or the failure to characterize accurately both Ayn Rand's nonfiction in Heller and in Burns, to the point where one of the takeaways I had reading these books was, I'm not convinced that these two authors actually read the things that they're citing, because if they really read them, there's something going really badly wrong. Like, the level of comprehension is below high school. Like, if you can't read this essay, or you can't read the Fountainhead and get some of these points, you must be squinting or something. I'm not sure what's happening, but it's not really attentive reading.
I just checked this when you were saying this. Like, is it my memory or what? She doesn't even discuss national emergencies in the essay. There's emergencies in the title. Maybe that was enough to trigger a sort of a viewpoint about what she thinks it might contain. Yeah, so much for scholarship. Continuing on this theme of objectivity, I've heard the point made that both Jennifer Burns and Anne Heller had access, or at least some access, to the Ayn Rand archives. And so since they had access to primary source material, their work must be objective or well-founded. And I find that a bit of a bizarre claim. But as you say in your article on the Burns book, and I'll quote from your essay, though Burns documents her research with 45 pages of endnotes, a bibliography, and an essay on sources, the book falls short of providing an objective reading and presentation of Ayn Rand's work, including archival materials. Can you say more about that issue of objectivity in the context, say, of archival research or scholarly standards?
Yeah, in the article, I mentioned an example of an offhand comment that Burns introduces into her book, but from journals Ayn Rand wrote for her own clarities in the 1930s. And one of the things, this is a colleague of mine brought this to my attention, and one of the things you get from Burns is Ayn Rand is reflecting on different accounts of what's going wrong in the world, and Burns lays there's what Burns says, and then there's what's in the actual document when you read it, which is now online and people can go look at it. And I analyze that in the essay. The gist of that, and I'll point people to go and look at it. The gist of that is Burns lays particular emphasis on one of the accounts, which is this idea that sort of a racial account, as if this is something Ayn Rand is taking seriously in her own notes to herself. When you read the notes, that's not, I think, the reading that leaps out off the page. She's taking into account a Marxist view, a religious view, a racist view, and then she's saying, none of these make any sense. This is my view over here. And I think what Burns is doing there is she's reading this document, this archival document, in a way that suggests both the preconception, so wanting to characterize Ayn Rand as some sort of conservative who's sort of obsessed with race or something like that, which is not even close to the truth, of course. Ayn Rand was opposed to racism, and she wrote about that in her published works. But there's a kind of innuendo that is injected by Burns in it. So I recommend people take a look at that in the essay. But the other kind of example I would raise here, under the heading of objectivity in research and writing, is a much bigger kind of example. And that is, and both authors do this, both Burns and Heller do this, they both spend a lot of time on Ayn Rand's relationship with Nathaniel Branden and Barbara Branden, who are younger associates of hers. And in particular, they're sort of unaccountably focused on this, in the sense that you could write about it. There's really interesting things to say about the way Nathaniel Branden was an intellectual early in the objectivist movement, the things, like what was it influence, and what was their interplay in terms of intellectuals. But what interests both of them to an astonishing degree is the personal relationship that began between Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden. I'm not very interested in that. But I think if you were going to write about this, you'd have to explain this. For my biography is about Ayn Rand, the intellectual, the novelist. Why is this relevant, and how does it illuminate anything? And I don't think either of them justify the amount of attention they give it, considering the things they don't give attention to, such as her positions on other issues in philosophy, her work writing her philosophical works and her novels. So there's a kind of distortion there. But the thing that connects to the question of objectivity is the reliability of these sources. So in both cases, they lean very heavily on the memoirs of Nathaniel Branden and Barbara Branden. And that you have to think about how reliable are these sources and what are the limitations? Are there any biases? Is there score settling? The answer is yes, there's score settling, they're biased, and above all, both of these authors that are being relied upon admit to dishonesty across decades. They admit to deception. Now, all of that should shape your view of this as a source. You might say, I have to wear a hazmat suit when I'm dealing with this because there's real problems here. You have to really, yeah, you just at a minimum, you have to ask yourself, what exactly can I trust here? Is there anything that you can trust here? Now, and then you'd have to tell the audience, your readers, here's my view of these sources. Here's how I'm treating them. You can tell, and I think this is defensible, and that's why I'm doing it. Now, Heller has no conception of doing that. She's really oblivious to that kind of question. And I think that just is, in that sense, her book isn't even trying to be concerned with objectivity. She just takes it wholesale, launders these sources as if they're as reliable as some gold standard kind of source. Whereas the interesting thing about Burns is she has in her essay about sources that you mentioned
way at the end.
At the end, she has an essay on sources. She mentions her own view that they're at least mixed, like they've got pros and they've got cons and there's problems with them. And then the kind of problems she admits to, you think, okay, you've said that they've got bias, you've said that they've got these problems, and you still use them, and you wait till the end of the book to tell us all this, and you don't flag in the text of the book, this is how I think of these sources, this is how I'm going to use them. Now, part of what I think objectivity in research and writing would require of her, if she's going to use these sources, is to go and be really upfront with the audience and say, look, here's the approach I'm taking with these difficult sources. You know, in the same way that if you had a partial source, like if you're doing historical work and all you have is a scrap of a letter, you can't treat the scrap you have as the whole story, right? But if what you're dealing with is a source that's compromised, that's not just incomplete, it's compromised. You have to be able, as a reader, to trust that it's been handled in a way that it acknowledges that, deals with the limitations. That's not at all what you get from Burns. And to me, that's one of the saddest aspects of this, which is Jennifer Burns, when I started reading the book, I didn't know that it would be as bad as it turned out to be. And I was excited about the topic. As I mentioned, I'm interested in the American right and its interface with Ayn Rand. And Jennifer Burns is a trained historian. She's not a journalist who just came up off the streets and like, I'm going to write something about Ayn Rand. She is someone who's looked upon as a scholar. And unfortunately, I don't think she lives up to that in this book. Just if you take some of the other kinds of evidence I mentioned, but this in particular, this is not at all how I think a scholar would handle this kind of material. And it speaks to something which is worth emphasizing in this conversation, which is, I think in definitely the Heller book, there's an unadmitted bias towards Ayn Rand. It comes out in sort of very sneering comments and treating Ayn Rand as sort of naive and gullible, and it's just without evidence. So it's not the case that maybe she was gullible. You would have to give evidence that she was. But what Heller does is just fantasize things that Ayn Rand didn't think of and say, well, wow, she didn't think of this, so maybe she wasn't as smart as you think she was. There's that whole undercurrent. It's really overt in Heller's book. In Burns's book, it's not as overt, but what happens is my argument about the failure of Burns in terms of dealing with her own perspective on Ayn Rand is that she wants us to think of her as a nonpartisan analyst, as a scholar. Fair enough. That's what she's announced herself as doing. In fact, the way the book unfolds, I think Burns gives privileged visibility to critics of Ayn Rand along the way. And I give some evidence of that in the article, to the point where you think, why is she giving more attention to the critics and not really doing any work to justify Ayn Rand's own view of herself or Ayn Rand's positions accurately, to the point where it becomes a kind of motif through the book. Like, don't take Ayn Rand seriously, take her critics seriously. And you might end up thinking that's true, but you would have to argue for that, not just inject it as an unadmitted motif of your book, which is, I think, why she is fastening on to the work of the Brandons, despite her own acknowledgement that these sources are compromised. At least, I mean, that's my characterization. I think hers is a little more evasive about that.
I have a bunch of things to say, but I don't want to take up too much time with it, but I mean, with my own feedback, but I'll say a few things. One is the Brandon biography, Nathaniel's Judgment Day. It's got paragraph after paragraph after paragraph after paragraph throughout the whole book of quotes from Ayn Rand. I don't remember what I said last week, let alone what someone else said to me 7 or 10 years ago. And pages and pages and pages and pages. Like, none of this is acknowledged. I mean, one has to acknowledge, like, these can't be quotes. Like, you might remember some formulation or some kind of barb or something that stuck and you just sort of remembered the words or something, but the idea that we're going to remember like chapters worth of quotes that you told me 10 years ago, I mean, on its face, this is deeply non-objective, and you just couldn't rely on it as a source. Even in ancient, like, my background is in ancient Greek philosophy, and it's like, we have an issue with sources too. So you look back at really old stuff and we only have reports. And, you know, when you look at one good source of some of our material on ancient Greek philosophy comes from this guy, Hippolytus. He's a 1st century bishop who wrote a work called Against All Heresies. Okay, well, you have a little bit of a hostile stance here, perhaps, and you have to kind of take that into account. Or Plutarch wrote a book called Against Stoic Self-Contradictions or something like that. And you say, okay, if you're reporting on the Stoics, then maybe there's a little element there and you have to take that seriously. This is not unknown in scholarship. So you would expect her to, Burns or something, to like, yeah, okay, this is a hostile source and we have to kind of treat it as such. And some things are reported here and so on, but you have to treat that in the right way. Not another book. Doesn't matter.
Just to build on that, Aaron, so one of the things that Burns acknowledges is that in the Barbara Brandon's book, there are passages that are presented as quotations from a source that is accessible now. And when she lined them up, she realized they don't line up. That there's just not accurate representations of what is in the recordings or the transcripts of the recordings. And I read that and I thought, and what did you do?
Now what? What's your conclusion? What do you come out of that? Is like,
and why didn't you tell me and the other readers much sooner that you think why is a person who's writing a book like that being treated as if they're much more reputable than they actually are? To me, that's the kind of, imagine if you were writing about Sigmund Freud, who was very admired in his field. Then he fell out of favor, and now he's sort of controversial in some respect. At least he was when I was in undergrad. And imagine you wrote about Sigmund Freud, and you shortchanged his own theories, and you don't really talk about his arguments. You don't really represent his views accurately. You insist that he's not really a psychologist. You insist on other things. You don't demonstrate the evidence. You don't present evidence to justify your position. And then you give the floor to his most unscientific and vindictive critics. Okay, that wouldn't be fair and objective to Sigmund Freud. If you do that to any other thinker, it wouldn't be fair or objective. And yet, that's essentially my assessment of how both of these authors treat Ayn Rand, is they really shortchange her own thought and her own statements and her just presenting her accurately. And then they give the floor, they really give emphasis to sources, in this case, that are not reliable and that obviously have a grudge, or they have scores to settle. And you have to really think about, okay, if your enemies wrote a biography of you, what would you do with that? And that's a misfortune. That's not something to celebrate. And I think this is one of the features of these books that, to me, discredits them. You can't really trust a biographer who's this loose and casual with the sources that they're using.
Yeah, and that's the other point I was going to make. But it was just that there's a kind of, if I talk to the critics, there's an assumption, even the most like vitriolic ones, there's a sense I'm getting more at the truth. If I talk to people who are actual experts in Ayn Rand's philosophy and they think she's right or substantially right, Well, that can't be objective. Like, I should throw that out. I won't even include that. That is really bizarre as a perspective. And the idea that I don't know what notion of objectivity they think they're working with, but it's neither neutrality, which is not Ayn Rand's conception of objectivity. I don't think objectivity involves neutrality. You can be very much opposed to, say, Marx, and write an objective biography about his thought. And also, if you knew some people who couldn't stand Marx and they just were really nasty about him, you wouldn't just give the floor to them for the whole thing. You'd like, no, people really have been animated by his thought. They've had political programs, social programs, a whole philosophic sort of genre coming out of his work. And talk to them. Why do they think he's right? Why do they think he's true? Because you're trying to get at the heart of her influence and her impact. That's one of the things. I want to say something about the ignoring. I want to ask you something about the consequences of ignoring her as a philosopher, because I think a lot of it has to do with they can't understand her impact. So one of the observations you make about both the Burns and the Heller books is that they don't give serious attention to Ayn Rand's deeper philosophy. And we've talked a bit about this already. One of the ways you put it in your article, you say, and it's a quote, "For Rand, philosophical ideas fundamentally shape the direction of political groups, of the culture, of history, of human life. This is a point not merely in one or two of Rand's essays. It is a pervasive theme of her thinking. But this is not a theme studied in Burns's book. That's not a minor omission. It's an oceanic gap." Close quote. What do you think is lost, both in understanding Ayn Rand and presenting her to the public, from this failure to attend to her philosopher and indeed her view of philosophy and the way it shapes a culture, a person?
Yeah, I think you miss the essence of what is so distinctive about her, what is so interesting about her as a person, and the path that she took in life, and what drove her to write the novels she did and to develop a philosophy. I think it goes to the heart of who she was. And if you're trying to illuminate a figure who's an intellectual, a public figure, a writer, a novelist, and you're missing that, you're missing the whole story. So imagine, just take a sporting analogy, imagine you wrote about the basketball career of Michael Jordan, and you don't talk about him as a basketball player. What are you talking about? What is the story really, if you're not talking about how he got there, how he trained, how he excelled, what he drove, what drove him? So I think it misses the essence. And just to put some flesh on that, Ayn Rand wrote a book called Philosophy Who Needs It, and it's not a question mark. That's everybody needs it. And the lead essay of that argues philosophy is fundamental and inescapable in human life. Here's evidence for that. Here's why I think this is true. She wrote dozens and dozens of essays about our American culture and different developments, from moon landing to the death of Marilyn Monroe to the papal encyclicals. Everything she talked about, it just runs through everything, that for her, philosophy is a fundamental factor everywhere you look. And she really saw it everywhere, and I think she was right to see it everywhere. That's a profound identification of hers, and it colors her fiction. It's not as if she was writing, I just want to write a story about people in New York. I want to dramatize a new ideal, a new moral ideal. Like, what does the ideal man look like? And she did that, and she had to develop her own thinking in philosophy and morality in particular, to come to a view of, this is what my hero looks like. This is what he does, how he behaves. This is how he dramatizes. This is how he should be dramatized. So this is a part of what's unique to her, is just this theme of the role of philosophy in human life, from top to bottom, from start to finish. And the default on that is a big part of her analysis of what's going wrong in the world and what goes wrong in people's lives, is that they're not thoughtful, they're not reflective, they're not trying to live as conceptual beings, to apply their thinking and to integrate their ideas and live by the guidance of philosophy. So both in terms of what an ideal looks like and what it means to deviate from that, and the consequences of that, it's all over what she has to say. And it's what she spent her time writing about and thinking about and trying to convince people of. And if you're emptying her life of the intellectual, philosophical substance, if you drain all of that out, you're draining out what is really a significant part of what Ayn Rand is and what's essential to her. And what you're left with is something that makes her less intelligible and conventional and boring, in effect. That's one of the tragedies of both of these books, is you take someone who's a bootstrapping immigrant. I'm an immigrant, and my story is very different from hers, but yeah, I really admire her for this. She comes here with very little money, escapes Soviet Russia, and she isn't just someone who makes it. She gets to write the kind of book she always wanted to write. She gets a play is produced, and she sells her scripts, and she becomes a best-selling novelist. And not only does she become best-selling novelist, people come to her because they see something profoundly interesting in her work. She becomes a public intellectual in her during her lifetime, and people line up around the block to go hear her speak at the Ford Hall Forum every year. So she is a massive presence in the culture, and she sees herself as challenging thousands of years of philosophical thought. Now, you don't have to agree with her that she's right about the views she comes to, but there's something really interesting in all that, both how she gets to the views she gets to, how she makes her case, the kind of vision she presents in her fiction of what is the ideal in human life. All of that is just fascinating. And when you end up with these, neither of these books really lives up to the task of illuminating that fascinating story of a person who comes here with nothing, achieves the American dream and then some, and becomes someone who influences American culture, creates a whole intellectual movement arises out of the philosophy that she originates. And what you come away with is something that's less interesting, less intelligible than what you would get if you explore this on your own. And that's the sense in which neither of these books is up to worthy of their subject. Neither of them, this is the argument I make in my essay. I read these so you don't have to, in the sense, like they're not worth your time. And I'm not one to discourage people from reading, but these are not going to give you what you expect if what you're hoping for is to better understand this unique intellectual figure, this creative mind who originated works that are resonating with people decades after they were first published.
So let's end on something more positive. What are there some kind of projects that you're working on, or something we can look forward to regarding to Ayn Rand, her work?
Yeah, I would emphasize two things. One, that I'm involved in the team here at the Institute that run the Ayn Rand archives. We're very proud of being the home for that massive collection. I think it's the most comprehensive collection of Ayn Rand materials in the world. One of our goals, our driving goal, is to bring more of the content of the archives online. We've already published more than 500 letters by Ayn Rand on the web. You can go search them. You can read everything she wrote in that, which was originated as a book about 30 years ago. We've also brought online in the last couple of years curated exhibit of Ayn Rand's notebooks for when she was writing The Fountainhead. We call it Blueprints for the Fountainhead. It tells you this, it gives you insight into how she thought about the project, what she was trying to work on. And we're doing more of that. So I think our goal is to bring everything we can online for people to explore and learn firsthand from primary sources that we have in the archive. So that's one thing that we're really pushing, and I'm excited about the work the team is doing. The other is I expect our archive team to be writing more material. You might have seen, if you read our journal, New Ideal, we've got some articles coming through in the last few years, drawing on the archives into doing original work and illustrating some of the aspects of Ayn Rand's life and development through the primary source materials. And I expect there'll be more on that coming. We have some interesting projects. I'm not ready to talk about them in detail, but I just mention that as something for people to look forward to. I will add one other thought here, which is I know I'm friendly with a scholar who's been working on a book on Ayn Rand's life for a number of years. Everything I know about her research is really impressive. So I have a lot of confidence that when that book surfaces, is published, I have confidence that's going to be a much more scholarly, objective treatment of Rand. So I haven't read it, and I don't know but that's everything encouraging. I would say that that's an encouraging direction to go in, that there is a work that I think is going to do justice to its subject in this respect. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, me too. So it looks like we're out of time, basically. So I want to point viewers to some resources that they might find interesting or that are related to our topic today. Of course, there are the two articles that Elan wrote that we've been discussing. So they're up there on the screen there. The other are the first two chapters in a book called A Companion to Ayn Rand. This is more of an academic work published by Blackwell. And the first two chapters there, entries in effect, are an introduction to the study of Ayn Rand by Greg Salmieri, which has a lot of important material related to objectivity in studying such a heterodox, controversial figure like Rand and what it looks like to take a thinker seriously. That's worth reading, and there's a link there on the screen because we actually have that available online. And the other one is, I think, the chapter 2 in that book. It's called The Life of Ayn Rand, Writing, Reading, and Related Life Events by Shoshana Milgram. And that has material on Ayn Rand's life, her work, and some critical material on existing biographical sources, like the Burns and the Heller books, but also others. So if you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and click the bell to get notifications for when we post new recordings. If you're watching the recording, please like, comment, and share the episode to help us attract new viewers. Please consider doing the same if you're watching this on Facebook. If you have questions or comments on today's episode, or you have suggestions for future episodes, please send us an email at newideal@aynrand.org. We do read all of your emails, and we reply to many of them. So that's it for today. Thank you very much, Elan. I hope everyone enjoyed the show.